I think the trouble is if you are truly fleeing persecution on account of your race, religion, your nationality, your political opinion, or your social group, sometimes you don't have time to wait.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper, and I'm joined today by Russell Moore. Today on our show, what's happening at the border? What do we make of Super Tuesday? And IVF, an Alabama court ruling, has brought the issue front and center. How should Christians be thinking about this moving forward? We have some great guests joining us for these conversations, so stay with us. All right, Russell Moore, welcome back. You have been literally on the other side of the world. I want to know, did it take coercion to get you on the back of a camel?
A little bit. I told my wife, Maria, I said, I've done this before. I don't need to do it again. And she said, yes, but you've never done it with me here. And I said, okay. So we did the camel ride after that.
Well, it's been an eventful few weeks in your absence. The world has continued to turn. One subject that's been perennially in the news is the ongoing crisis at the border. Officials reported 140,000 apprehensions at the southern border in February. That's up from 124,000 the month before. 50,000 migrants were processed at one port of entry alone. That's actually down from 302,000 that were processed in December. Spring generally sees a surge in crossings, so many at the border are bracing for that. Border towns are bracing for that as well. Joining us to talk about these things is Bree Stensrud. Bree is the director of Women of Welcome and a human dignity advocate. She's the author, most recently, of Start with Welcome, The Journey Towards a Confident and Compassionate Immigration Conversation. Bree Stensrud, welcome to The Bulletin.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Your story is fascinating to me. Your work took you from advocacy inside the pro-life movement to working on behalf of immigrants and refugees. Before we get into the topic itself, I'd love to hear you describe a little bit of that journey.
Sure. I grew up an evangelical free church pastor's kid in the Midwest. And so I'm blonde-haired, blue-eyed, conservative, corn-fed girl who literally just has all kind of privilege and comfort all around myself. And of course, you grew up in evangelical culture and you are a pro-lifer. And that's what you do. You attend the pregnancy center marches and you hear your dad preach about abortion from the pulpit. But then when I got older and I started working in the pro-life movement professionally, I was really mentored in, and Dr. Moore was part of this mentorship, mentored into what it really meant to be a whole life pro-lifer and moved from this traditional sense of what it meant to be pro-life and advocating just for the preborn and for those kids who are in foster care or orphanages around the world to a holistic human dignity ethic. And I think it's surprising that people still think it's interesting that immigration is a pro-life issue, because we're talking about human dignity issues, and the same things that anchor us in the preborn space are the same biblical underpinnings that anchor us in every other human dignity space.
One of the statistics that I found interesting this week, 70% of white evangelicals tend to refer to the issues at the border as a crisis. Is what's going on at the border a crisis right now?
I think we have a mismatched approach and a narrative to what is actually going on at the border. We do have what I would say is a humanitarian crisis at the border, but we are tending to meet that response with a military response instead of a humanitarian response. You have so many people who are showing up at the border and seeking asylum, and many of them will not qualify because a lot of them are coming from economic hardship. But they don't necessarily know that, and we don't even know our own immigration laws. And so you have a massive influx of families and single adults and people who are really trying to just find a better life, and they're not looking to evade Border Patrol. They're looking to find Border Patrol. So it's a massive amount of people. So I would say it's a humanitarian crisis, but I wouldn't say anyone's overpowering or overrunning the Border Patrol and the infrastructure that we have there currently.
But Bree, wouldn't you say that there are some real problems with our asylum laws meant for people who are fleeing from political persecution, religious persecution for their lives? And many would say what people are doing is taking advantage of that by saying, yes, I know I'm going to be apprehended at the border, and then I'm just going to be released into society and I can wait it out. Is it true that we're sending mixed messages to people?
100% we're sending mixed messages. I also think it's a big reality that most people who come to the border don't understand our immigration policies. They don't understand our asylum policies, and much like Americans don't as well. But what they do understand is that we have a broken system, and that if they come in and they meet an initial threshold of fear of persecution and they can pass a background check, they're going to be in this country while they await their adjudication process, which is right now 4 to 6 years, which is completely irresponsible in terms of human flourishing and for economic development and all of the dynamics that we see politically for Americans. So I do think there are some who come to exploit the system because the system is so broken. But many people are coming because they feel like this is the only legal option to get into the U.S.
Would it be better to have them wait outside the country for these things to be adjudicated?
You know, there are programs that advocates are pushing for that say, all right, let's create programs so people can apply in country so that they don't have to make these dangerous treks and cause more trauma to themselves and their families. I think the trouble is if you are truly fleeing persecution on account of your race, religion, your nationality, your political opinion, or your social group, sometimes you don't have time to wait. And we know how backlogged our system currently is right now. So if you have a credible threat and a fear for your life, and you have to wait 6 years in your country, right now, people who are waiting to be reunified with family in that legal pathway are waiting up to 10 years. So if you're truly afraid for your life, that can feel like an ineffective means to try and get to the U.S. and try and get to safety. But it'd be great if we had those programs.
What's the obstacle to that kind of programming? Because I think that's one of the things that no one seems happy with the system on any side of this issue. Is it simply sort of Washington gridlock, polarized politics?
Oh, it's partisan politics for sure. We just saw that with having a bill on the floor that everyone was going to vote for. And then the previous president made his announcement of we shouldn't do this. Let's wait till I'm in office. And then everybody just folded. And so it is partisan politics for sure. There's no getting around that.
Russell, you've written about these issues for a long time. I remember reading an article of yours that shifted my perspective on this, maybe 15 years ago or more. How have you seen evangelicals shift in the way they are thinking about these issues over the years? Has it always been polarized in exactly this way, or has it moved over time?
I think what's confusing to people is they look at survey results, the polls. And in that sense, I don't think that there's been much of a shift in terms of the way that evangelical Christians think, at least church-going evangelical Christians. What matters, though, is not we could have data that would say 80% of evangelical Christians are in favor of finding some way to help dreamers, for instance. 92% of the people in the country are. The problem is that members of Congress and others know that, you've got 70%, 80% of the people who, if they're asked, what do you think should be done about dreamers, will say, I think we should do this. The people who really care about it and for whom it's going to be their only issue are usually people who are anti-immigration reform and anti-refugee. As long as there's that lopsided kind of intensity, then it's just impossible to get anything done. And that's also true when you have people who are worried about their primaries rather than worried about general elections. That puts a lot of Democrats in the situation where they're not wanting to go very far on actual border security for fear of being seen as anti-immigrant, and Republicans who are fearful of doing even the most minimal things when it comes to addressing the immigration system. That used to be, in terms of maybe what you would call the compassion part of it, pathway to citizenship or dreamers or so forth. Now it also includes the border security part because there are a lot of people who'd rather have the issue than they would a solution.
And now that we don't have Roe v. Wade, there is not that political wedge out there to say, all right, so what is the next thing that we're going to hold on to and just beat the drum about? And I think immigration is that new mainstay political wedge for people.
One of the stories that's really, particularly on the right, captured a lot of headlines in the last couple of weeks is the death of Laken Riley. Riley was a 22-year-old nursing student. She was murdered a couple of weeks ago in Georgia. The suspect is a Venezuelan man who came to the States illegally, was allowed to stay while pursuing his immigration case. He was apprehended several times before as the suspect of other crimes, and then subsequently released back into the States. So what do you say to those who are looking at a case like this and blaming the border policy, the lack of screening, the lack of enforcement, especially because of the fact that this person had been known to authorities before this for other issues?
You have to acknowledge that this was a horrific happening and that this man did slip through part of our systems and part of our checkpoints. And that is just a real reality and a vulnerability that we do have. And so there needs to be justice in that instance. He needs to be punished to the full extent of the law in that instance. But what I would challenge us to see is that the vast majority of people, we have millions of people showing up at our southern border. They are coming to flee that very thing that happened to that young woman. And so to punish the entirety of those who are showing up would be unfair and would be unjust. When you go down to the border and you talk to Border Patrol, yes, they are tired. Yes, they are weary. Yes, they have recruiting challenges and they want you to pray for the rising suicide rates and all of those things. They are weary, but they're not being overrun. And what they'll tell you from their own statistics is that their apprehension rate for those who are seeking to evade them has gone from 42% back in the early 2000s to now 81%. They're estimating that they are capturing, they're apprehending those who are seeking to evade them at 81%, which is a massive jump in the amount of border security and effectiveness that we're having. And we know that most of the illegal activity that is happening, the crime that we don't want coming into our communities, drugs and the fentanyl crisis is another huge one. We know that actually 90% of that activity happens at legal ports of entry with American citizens. 88% of those who are carrying and trafficking, smuggling drugs across the border are American citizens, young male Americans. And so we have to really look at what improvements have been made and how can we continue to improve. Border security is a very big thing, and Border Patrol will tell you they need more help. And customs agents at legal ports of entry will tell you we need more accountability and thorough screening. But all of that has to be appropriated by Congress. And the longer that they are ineffective in their job to provide solutions, we can see some of these horrific things that happen.
Donald Trump appeared in an interview on Monday, and he described migrants like this. He said, they're rough people. In many cases, they're from jails, prisons, from mental institutions, insane asylums. You know insane asylums, that's Silence of the Lambs stuff. Hannibal Lecter, anybody know Hannibal Lecter? We don't want him in this country. He also secured the nomination this week for the Republican Party. So how do you make sense of this rhetoric inside the party that's the primary affiliation of the pro-life movement, the evangelical movement? How do you make sense of that? And where is that headed?
The question is, what do we mean by the pro-life movement? If what we're talking about are simply people who would say, I'm against abortion, that's one thing that will say that. It's another thing if you're talking about the people who are actually boots on the ground when it comes to caring for preborn children and their moms in distress. And that's one of the reasons why Bria and I have talked about this many times before. If I'm going into a community and trying to find people who are going to care for a refugee community that's there, I will often start with the pro-life women who are working in crisis pregnancy centers because they already have a sense of the image of God. They already have a sense that people are not defined by their usefulness. They already have a sense of human vulnerability, and they're able to have that sort of connection with them. But David Frum wrote this article several years ago about looking at the survey data when it comes to what voters actually care about. And he said the so-called family values voters, abortion's not in the top ranking of what they care about. Neither are these family issues. It's race and immigration. There's a primal sort of reaction to that. And I think until we deal with that, we're never going to get at this. But evangelical Christians, like everybody else, can have many different views on what immigration reform should be. There's no Bible verse that says there should be 300,000 asylum seekers let in as opposed to 250,000 asylum seekers. There are all kinds of different viewpoints that people can have about how to secure the border, how to care for those who are seeking asylum. What we can't have as Christians differing opinions about are immigrants themselves. And that's the kind of thing that you're talking about with the kind of language that Trump was using there, the kind of language he's used elsewhere with speaking of people as vermin, they're poisoning the blood. That is really dangerous, dehumanizing language. Not just because historically we know where that leads and it's not to any place good, but also because of what it does to you. Once you start to have this viewpoint of human beings, there's an erosion of the conscience that's not conformity to Christ.
Even just to build on that too, if you look past what exactly he's saying, what he's preying on is he's preying on the fears of the American people. He's preying on their fears of a changing American culture, about safety and crime and drug use and that big epidemic in our country. You have someone who looks like he's going to, quote, bat for you, someone who's taking your fears seriously. And when survey after survey says that less than 5% of pastors are preaching about or speaking or teaching and discipling their congregations about what the Bible says about immigration, it's no wonder that there's this open highway of thought for some really, quote, strong political candidate to come in and say, you know what? I'm not going to be weak on this. Lifeway Research just came out with a new study just a couple of weeks ago, and they said 4 out of 5 self-identified evangelicals who are sitting in the pews say they would love to hear a sermon from their pastor about how to apply biblical principles to the immigration issue.
Yeah, but the pastor knows the one.
Exactly.
That's who's going to call on Monday morning.
What is also true is only 26% of self-identified evangelicals say that the Bible is their main influence on this issue. And so we have a discipleship problem in this country. And really, the political pundits are filling the gap and preying on people's fears when we are not choosing to step up, encourage, and disciple our own congregations on these issues. I direct a national advocacy community of Christian women who want to engage this issue not from partisan politics, but from their faith first and foremost. So really, our community is dedicated to diving into the whole of Scripture to understand what God's heart is for the immigrant and the refugee. And so we take immersion trips down to the border to get in closer proximity to people, to see what the church is doing on both sides of the border, to see what the government, to see what law enforcement is doing on both sides of the border, so that the issue actually becomes personal to Christian women who actually want to have a better conversation. The truth is, we have the nations showing up along the southern border. And I think so many people are worried about who's showing up at the southern border, not seeing this as an opportunity for the gospel. Only 40% of self-identified evangelicals say that this is an opportunity. The massive amount of people that are coming to our border from around the globe is an opportunity to introduce people to Christ. That's a huge problem. Part of what we do is we say, all right, bring your fear, bring your compassion, bring your conviction, and we're going to live in the both and together. We can have safe and secure borders, and we should also have humane treatment of people who are arriving at the border. What does that look to live in the messy middle? Not that you have to leave your conviction or your compassion or your political party, whatever. I actually don't care how you vote, because we need people who care about human dignity issues on both sides of whatever fence you want to be on. So we're strictly nonpartisan, and we say, all right, let's not talk about partisan politics, let's talk about people. And I think that's helpful, especially for a lot of conservative evangelicals who have not found a way to talk about this well, and they want to act on their God-given compassion.
Bree Sensrud is the director of Women of Welcome. Her book is titled Start with Welcome. Bree, thanks again. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Bree.
We will be right back. Russell, do you hear that sound?
I do hear that sound.
Do you know what that sound is?
Hail to the chief.
It is. It's also the sound of hope and change. It's not Barack Obama. It's not Donald Trump. It's not Joe Biden. It's Jason Palmer. Do you know who Jason Palmer is?
Yes, American Samoa.
Winner of the Democratic primary in American Samoa. Jason Palmer won 51 votes, which was enough to secure 6 delegates. Jason Palmer is not a resident of Twin Peaks, nor is he a relative of Leland and Laura. And if you get that joke, we could probably be friends. Jason Palmer is a businessman and an entrepreneur who is running in the primary to try to help signal a desire for generational change. He told ABC, "This is the message that Joe Biden needs to hear, that the American people want to pass the torch to the next generation. ABC then quickly cut away to get back to season 197 of Grey's Anatomy, which, yes, actually, dear listener, that show's still on the air. Meanwhile, the larger result of Super Tuesday is that Nikki Haley is out. Donald Trump is the presumptive Republican nominee.
Yes, dear listener, that show also is still on the air.
Still on the air. And the replay of 2020 continues, only worse. Russ, what do we make of it?
It's not unexpected, but I think it's one of those things where the sort of language that was employed so often in 2016 and even in 2020, not going along with all of this, but it's a binary choice. All those things are gone. You had people who clearly had alternatives, and they voted for somebody who has been found by a jury and judge to have committed rape, somebody who has said he would suspend the Constitution, somebody who tried to overthrow an election, somebody who's facing felony criminal counts, you just go on and on. It's not as though there's some confusion as to who this person is now. There's no way to try to find a way to make this seem better than it is. It's not good.
The numbers are astonishing when you look at polling numbers, and that some 3/4 of Americans on both sides would rather have a different candidate other than Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And yet here we are. Is the two-party system broken?
Yeah, it's broken. And it's too democratic, small d democratic. I think we actually were in a much better place when the parties did have more involvement in the choosing of nominees. Look at who the smoke-filled rooms gave us. For Harry Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower. And you could just go down through the list. And what are we getting now? Reality television stars and so forth. Yeah, it's broken. It's not working right now.
You've had these inflection points where you go back a year ago, DeSantis looked ascendant. It looked like he was ahead of Trump in the polls. He had just won this massive governor's race. It looked like anything could happen. And then he starts to slip. And then you have the Jack Smith documents case. And it looks like, oh man, Trump's toast. And the arrest didn't make a difference. The E. Jean Carroll case didn't necessarily make a difference. But there was this special prosecutor that was looking into President Joe Biden and released this statement saying, essentially, we can't really prosecute Joe Biden because he's an elderly man who seemed very confused when we tried to question him about these things. No jury's going to convict. And say what you want about the facts or the merits of the case at any level on that thing. But nonetheless, when that dropped, it felt like one of these moments where he has to get out now. There were a million op-eds written about it's time for Joe to get out. And I was looking at that going, that would at least shake things up. Like something different might happen. It wouldn't be 2020 all over again. And it still might be two choices that are very difficult for a lot of Christians. It would be difficult for me. But nonetheless, it would change the channel from this inevitability. And it's a month later and no, nothing's different. Nothing's changed. So to me, I feel like 2024 is Thanos. It's the inevitable. Like we're just on this sort of doomsday course. What do we say then to Christians who are looking at this going, this does feel like doomsday, and I don't know how to feel optimistic about what this means for the church in either direction. How should I feel right now?
Don't feel optimistic about the state of the church, I think is the first place to start. And what I mean by that is this. There's a difference between optimism and hope. And if we have hope, Scripture says hope that is seen is not hope. And we're resting on the promise of Jesus to build his church. We know that's true. That's very different from the kind of PR that comes in and says, oh, everything's great and everything's going to be great. Short term, we could go through some very difficult times. And if we're not honest about that, then we're not actually Christ-like, because Jesus does that. There's no happy talk coming in about the short term for his disciples. These things are going to happen. You will be put out of the synagogues. That's not a popular sort of message, but it's true. And I think there are a lot of people who, when they're looking at this, they're saying, do you even see and understand what's happening here? And I think there have to be some of us who do.
Do you think there's a chance that the course changes at this point? For instance, I made a bet with a friend in October. I bet a steak dinner that Biden would be out by the end of April. I said, I just don't see how it's possible. There's no ways. And look, I got 6 weeks, 8 weeks left to go here. I could still be right.
You could always say it's just an April Fool's bet on April 1st. Yeah.
But he could decide to get out. Some extraneous circumstance could take him out of the race. And anything's possible. But that's part of what makes this so wild. Even if you just look at actuary tables of the ages of these men, Biden is older. Trump does not appear to be in peak physical form in his own right. So you take that alone, then you add on top of it various forms of political trouble, particularly for Trump, like the Colorado Supreme Court ruling to get overturned. He's going to be on the ballot, but he's got many other lawsuits. There are many other things that could come about and take him out of the race, which for one is an argument for why on earth would you nominate this guy? But for another says, man, it still feels weirdly unpredictable, even while it feels inevitable.
I think it was Mike Murphy who said, part of Trump's superpower is that there's so much chaos and corruption and lack of character that no one thing then stands out. So with Biden, you've got, he's old. And every time you see him, he's going to remind you he's old. And so you're able to put it in that category. With Trump, there are so many things that hit every single day that no one of them can even lodge. And then you add to it the difference between the kind of cult of personality that has emerged around Trumpism means that it's not that you have people who are, I like him in spite of all of this stuff. You have people who actually like him because of that, including people who go to church on Sundays and sing praise choruses sometimes. That's just the reality. And so those are not symmetrical sorts of options. Now, the question's going to be, you've got, 87% of the American people who said they thought that President Biden was too old. That includes a lot of Democrats and independents and some Republicans who are going to nonetheless vote for Joe Biden because they know what the alternative is. It's going to be an unpredictable next 6 months. I don't think that the candidates are what's going to be unpredictable, though.
Yeah, Mark Cuban last week said if Biden were in the hospital being read his last rites by a priest, I would still go into the booth and vote for him, which I think is the posture of a lot of people at this point. So Nikki Haley proved not more formidable, but I think more interesting than a lot of people would have predicted. Haley served in the Trump administration. She was very loyal to Trump throughout those years. She was critical of him before she joined the administration. She was loyal throughout it. And then she had this kind of slow ramp into her criticism of Trump during the primary to the point that she got more interesting about it towards the end, and her numbers got higher. And then just before Super Tuesday, she essentially said, I'm not going to stick to this commitment I made early on to support the eventual nominee, which was a very obvious way of her saying, look, if I'm out after Tuesday, don't expect me to endorse. And then she didn't endorse. I'd be curious, looking back, what do you make of the Haley candidacy? What value did it contribute to the race? And where does she go from here?
She's a really impressive person, and she handled, for instance, debates really impressively. So she had coherent viewpoints on the issues, and she knew how to fight at least the candidates who weren't Trump. So she could really deal with Vivek Ramaswamy, for instance. What happens to her, I don't know. I remember very well in about this time in 2016, her, Tim Scott, Marco Rubio, and Trey Gowdy standing together in South Carolina, and her listing off the reasons why Trump is unfit to serve as president, all of which are even more true now than they were then. And she nonetheless got in line. Maybe she won't this time, I don't know, but I remember that.
And now the thing that seems to be happening is you have this sort of undercard race for who's going to be the VP nominee for Trump. Doesn't seem like anything's going to change on Biden's side.
Tim Scott's going to be the VP, I think.
You think so? He's certainly doing the performance.
We know Trump does not want somebody who's going to outshine him and take away his spotlight. Also, though, because he really wants to win, because he knows he's going to be in federal custody one way or the other after all of this is over. And so I just don't think he's going to go with a J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson type.
Yeah. Interestingly, the other name that I saw floated a lot in the last 2 weeks was Ben Carson, which is not a name you've heard a lot from in the last couple of years, but checks similar boxes to Tim Scott. The difference being between Scott and Carson is that Carson doesn't aspire necessarily to be president. He wouldn't aspire to go on.
Yeah, the only thing we know for sure is that whoever this VP nominee is, Trump will hate in 4 years at the far end and say is an overrated character. So that's all we know for sure.
The polls for Biden have been absolutely terrible the last few months and getting worse progressively. And the New York Times published a poll on Saturday, and it was bad. And a lot of progressives and Democrats reacted at the Times like it was the Times' fault that the poll was bad. And I remember reading a couple of people who were looking at it saying, hey, y'all, like some of these crosstabs are basically blank in the poll, meaning they're holding back some of the data. So if you hate this one, wait till tomorrow when they publish the next round, which is probably going to be worse. And it was. Yeah. And so you've got like national polling, battleground states, everything looks pretty good for, you'd rather be Donald Trump right now in terms of the numbers. Now that the primaries are done, and as we start getting into, for lack of a better term, trial season for former President Donald Trump, do you think those numbers hold, or do you think that's going to start to erode?
I don't think the trial season is going to have much to do with it one way or the other. I do think that what could change things will be Donald Trump being in front of people. It's hard to imagine who are the undecided voters out there who have not seen both of these guys for the last 30 years in a lot of ways. I think that having Trump out there and having an actual memory of who this person is and what that's could change things. I don't think the trials themselves will. Because there's no new information. We already have all of that. We've had a January 6th commission. We've seen all of this with our own eyes. I don't know what's going to tip people, other than I think there are going to be a lot of people who right now are in a Biden's too old mode who may well Mark Cuban decision as we get closer. And it starts to become more real, that this actually is a real thing.
Is there anything happening in the midst of this? Obviously, everywhere you go, people want to talk to you about this stuff, whether you're at churches, college campuses, or just among other leaders. Is there anything you're hearing that does give you a reason for optimism in the midst of this?
Yeah, a lot of it. If you look at, for instance, on college campuses, you've got a lot of Trumpy ethno-nationalist populism, but not a lot of it from Christians. It's more of the Barstool Sports neo-pagan student. The evangelical Christians don't usually fit into that paradigm. That gives me a lot of hope for the future, that it could have been the situation where the way that all this stuff has been normalized in American society, it could have been even more normalized among people who've never seen anything else. But the data just doesn't show that. So I'm hopeful about that. And we're in a situation where you have already the country strained to the breaking point, friendship strained to the breaking point, and we're going to do this again. There's no way to spin that as a positive thing.
We shall see. The year continues. 2024, the year of Thanos. We will be back after this. We're back. On February 23rd, 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos created through in vitro fertilization, or IVF, are children under state law. This ruling allows 3 couples who lost frozen embryos in an accident at a storage facility to sue the fertility clinic and the hospital for the wrongful death of a minor. The ruling is a reflection of the shifting and uncertain legal status of IVF in a post-Roe world, leaving many physicians and proponents of IVF feeling anxious about the legal implications. And while some pro-lifers have welcomed the ruling, many, even among those who are critical or skeptical of the practice of IVF, have seen it as overly harsh. Joining Russell and I to talk about it is Dr. Jeffrey Keenan, an infertility and reproductive medicine specialist. He also leads the National Embryo Donation Center and is the medical director and a fertility specialist at Rejoice Fertility in Knoxville, Tennessee. Dr. Keenan, welcome to the Bulletin.
Mike and Russell, thanks very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Dr. Keenan, can you help listeners understand what exactly took place in this ruling and how this came about?
Well, the ruling was about a case that did appear to involve some negligence on the part of the clinic, because all cryo storage rooms should be secured at all times, and theirs wasn't. That's what ultimately led to the loss of 3 sets of embryos. The patients sued, and the Alabama Supreme Court felt that because of the way their state laws were written and because of previous legal precedents or cases, that the only way they could rule on this was that it was a violation of the Protection of Minors Act and therefore loss of life. I did not read the whole 130 pages of the ruling, but the justices were concerned that it would impact IVF. They stated that was not their intention, but of course it did. And so I think the alarm bells went off to any reproductive endocrinologist who heard about this, is that if you can be found guilty with civil or criminal penalties for loss of life of human embryos, then what would happen if, for example, there is an accident in the lab or during the embryo transfer or something like that, which result in the loss of the embryos? And that is a pretty big legal burden to carry when you're dealing with microscopic patients, if you will.
Russell, you and I were talking about this before we began recording today, and you mentioned that even among some of the harsher critics of IVF, they're looking at this ruling saying, this ruling takes things in a pretty radical new direction. Could you describe a little bit the spectrum of thought on the issue and how this ruling reflects that spectrum?
You really have 3 places on the spectrum. You have some people who would say IVF is fine, there's no abortion, there's no problem, and so therefore they're quite comfortable being both pro-life and pro-IVF. You have other people who would say, I'm not anti-IVF, but I am anti-destruction of embryos, because, of course, the pro-life position is that a person is a person from the moment of conception, and so freezing those persons indefinitely or destroying them would be wrong. So those people would argue for there's a kind of IVF that's acceptable as long as it doesn't do that. And then there are those of us who are uncomfortable with IVF, not just because of what happens to embryos, but also because of the way that it severs procreation from the one flesh union, have concerns about the way that that changes the way that we view children. So, for instance, I will often have people who will say to me, is it okay to pursue IVF as long as we use all the embryos? I think that language itself is a problem. The way that we speak and the metaphors we use reveal a lot about how we think, and we have concerns about that. Part of what we have to do in terms of laws is not just have laws, but also to persuade people to have a kind of moral consensus of some sort before something happens. And that didn't happen here, which is one of the reasons why you have such incoherence of people saying, well, I support the ruling, but I also am pro-IVF, without explaining, well, how? What does that look like? I think that's one of the reasons why people are concerned. And the other thing is, I think there's a lot of conflicted emotions here. So, those of us who have some concerns about IVF, nonetheless, are very happy to see the children that we know in the world who have come about by IVF. No one's saying that they shouldn't be here any more than by saying that we think ideally we ought to have 2 parents married to have children. That doesn't mean we think that people who came to birth from a single mother ought not to exist. So you have that sort of conflict. And you have the people who are pro-IVF who will say, we don't want to say that these embryos are just nothing either. We do believe that life begins at conception. So there are a lot of people who are having great difficulty working through these issues, and I understand that.
Dr. Keenan, you're involved with the issue of embryo adoption. Could you talk a little bit about what does that mean? Some people may not even be familiar with the phrase, and all of a sudden, with this ruling, that's a phrase we're hearing in the news quite often.
Frequently in IVF, more embryos are created than will be used at the time of their creation. When that occurs, they are generally cryopreserved or frozen. vitrified is the more technical term at this point, and then they can be used later. But what if that family has decided that, for example, well, they can't afford another child, or perhaps the mother has a hysterectomy or one of the parents dies and they can't use these embryos? Then what do you do with these embryos, which so many couples view as the siblings of the child or children that they have? The only legal options are to keep them frozen indefinitely, which I always say doesn't work because you're not going to live indefinitely, to destroy them either by discarding them or by using them in research or donating them to another couple. So those options to me are very limiting, but the only ethical option would be to donate them to another couple. And that's why we started the National Embryo Donation Center 20 plus years ago. And we're coming up on 1,500 births from couples who have donated their embryos and recipients who want to use those embryos to create their own family.
Dr. Keenan, I support what it is that you do in terms of your ministry with embryo adoption and have for a long time. I'm wondering, are there enough people in the country who are willing to adopt embryos to be able to have that as a widespread answer to this dilemma?
I think the short answer to that is no, Russell. And the reason I say that is that we probably are still freezing more embryos that aren't going to be used than we are using them in embryo adoption. Now, ultimately, that problem could be solved because the number of embryos created could be limited and embryo adoption could be practiced by more clinics. And instead of only a few thousand births in a year, there could be tens of thousands of births if that happens. So there is a potential way out of this mess. But right now, with the trajectory that we're on now, I don't see that happening.
Do you see the technology changing in the near future where IVF can be done without creating multiple embryos?
Well, it actually can be done without creating multiple embryos. And we do that here in our clinic. You can do something called natural cycle IVF. You can do minimal stimulation IVF. We also can freeze eggs, so we don't have to freeze embryos. And certainly we have patients who say, yeah, I don't want to go through more than one ovarian stimulation. But on the other hand, I don't want to create excess embryos. So just inseminate 2 or 3 of them. And then if we get a good embryo or 2 from that, we'll transfer it. If not, we'll use the frozen eggs that we stored for a subsequent cycle. And so there's no ethical objections or issues in discarding frozen eggs, just like there isn't in discarding frozen sperm.
One of the ironies of these conversations, and frankly, one of the landmines of this conversation, is we're 3 men sitting here having this conversation. And obviously, IVF affects men as well, but it's an issue that's deeply personal to many women who want to have a family and have struggled for various reasons, whether it's fertility issues or cancer or other circumstances and conditions. And in the debate that has emerged around this Alabama ruling, Christian women have been among some of the sharpest dissenters from the ruling as well. I wonder, how do we talk about this issue with Christians, Christian women in particular, who are aspiring to have a family and who see this technological miracle that IVF is as their only pathway to pursuing that?
That's part of what I mean by the complexity of this, because what one is having to say at the same time is, here are some things you should think about in terms of the ethics behind this, while at the same time saying infertility is an awful thing. I mean, I say that as one half of a previously infertile couple, and the grief that goes along with that and the sense of desperation that goes along with that sometimes is overwhelming. And it's one of the reasons why I was seeing something the other day about how necessary it is to have ethical funeral directors because of the kind of emotional and otherwise vulnerability that people are in. The same thing really is true at the start of life. You have to have trusted, ethical medical treatment. And so there are complexities here in saying it's a good thing to have a child. It's a good thing to have medical technology that enables somebody to have a child. But there also are these questions that we shouldn't just put to the side just because of the end result. And that's a difficult thing to talk about in a moment like now, because the question really isn't, should the Alabama Supreme Court ruling be the way that we go? It's much more complex than that, and that's part of the problem with having that conversation right now.
I'll echo that and just say that although, yes, IVF is really a technological marvel and miracle for many patients, it has also opened a Pandora's box, especially from a Christian or biblical perspective, allowing things like gestational surrogacy, which sometimes involves the exploitation of women, which allows for single women to have children outside of wedlock, which allows gay couples to have children. And so those are very controversial ideas. In addition, it allows for things like sex selection, choosing the sex and then discarding the embryos that aren't of the desired sex, and other issues involved with pre-implantation genetic testing. So we've created a lot of technological side effects basically by our process of IVF. And unfortunately, the industry is almost unregulated in this country.
That is fascinating to hear that. I read that the other day as I was looking at this particular case, how one of the complaints is the lack of regulation around IVF. And so part of what makes this ruling so interesting is it's like you have an environment that it's sort of the Wild West, and then you have this very blunt instrument in terms of the ruling from Alabama that kind of imposes a standard that's a maximalist standard in this environment. So certainly I can understand why those who watch it much more closely than I have up to this point are feeling a certain sense of whiplash around it. It's a fascinating question and fascinating issue. Dr. Keenan, this is very insightful. We appreciate you making time to be with us here today on The Bulletin.
Thanks so much for having me, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Before we go, on a personal note, I feel like I should give a shout out here to my good friends Jonathan and Kate and their daughter Rosie, baby 980 of the National Embryo Donation Center. Though Rosie would be the first to tell you she's not a baby anymore. You can learn more about the NEDC, embryo donation, and embryo adoption through the link in our show notes. That's it for us this week, but we actually want to hear from you. Visit morect.com/bulletin to take our listener survey. And if you've already filled that out, but haven't left us a rating or review wherever you listen, do that too. It helps us out and helps other people find the show. If you really love us, consider subscribing to CT. That'll help us keep making the show. All right, that's it for this week. See you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's executive produced by Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper. It's produced by Clarissa Mall and Matt Stevens. Post-production by TJ Hester. Our art for this episode is by Rick Shooks. Music by Dan Phelps. And social media by Kate Lucky. Thanks for listening.